Picture this. You are 67 years old. It is a Sunday morning in October, and the leaves outside your kitchen window have turned that deep, burning amber that only happens in fall. You are standing at the counter in your robe. The coffee is brewing. The house is completely quiet. Not silent the way a house is silent when someone is missing. Quiet the way a house is quiet when it belongs entirely to you. You pour your coffee into the mug you actually like. The one that was always pushed to the back of the cabinet because someone else preferred the other one. You take it to the chair by the window. Not the chair you were supposed to sit in, your chair. And you sit there in the October light with your coffee and you think, this is mine. This morning is mine. This quiet is mine. This life, unfolding in exactly the way I am choosing to let it unfold, is mine. And somewhere deep inside your chest, underneath everything society told you to feel about this moment, underneath the word lonely and the word alone and the word sad, there is something else entirely. There is peace. There is fullness. There is something that feels, if you are completely honest with yourself, remarkably like freedom. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to really sit with this question. When you pictured that woman in that kitchen this morning, did you feel sorry for her? Because here is the truth most people will never say out loud. The world wants you to feel sorry for her. The world wants you to see her as a woman who ended up alone, a woman who lost something, a woman whose life did not go according to plan. But what if that is completely, fundamentally, profoundly wrong? What if that woman in the kitchen is not the sad ending of someone's story? What if she is the beginning of the most extraordinary chapter a woman can live? That is what this video is about. Not just surviving on your own after 60, not just coping, not just making peace with being single. We are going way past that today. Today we are going to talk about why living alone after 60 for millions of American women right now is not the consolation prize. It is the prize itself. If this is already speaking to something in you, something you have felt but maybe never heard someone else say, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now. I post every single week for women exactly like you, women who are in this chapter of life and are ready to see it with completely new eyes. This channel exists for you. And now let us get into it. Let us start by naming something that most people refuse to name. There is a story our culture has been telling women for generations. It goes like this. A woman's life has a shape. She grows up, she falls in love, she marries, she builds a home around a man and children, and that is her purpose, her meaning, her identity. And if something disrupts that shape, if a marriage ends, if a husband dies, if she simply chooses a different path, then the shape is broken, and a broken shape means a broken life. That is the story, and it is so embedded in our culture, in our movies and our greeting cards, and the way our neighbors talk, and the things our own families have said to us over the years, that most women have absorbed it so deeply, they do not even realize it is just a story. It is not the truth. It is a story that was written for a different time, by people with very specific interests in keeping women dependent, compliant, and convinced that their value was determined by their relationship status. And I want you to hear me clearly when I say this. That story was never about your happiness. It was never about your freedom. It was never about who you actually are. And the most radical, powerful, breathtaking thing a woman over 60 can do right now, in this moment in American history, is to put that story down, set it on the table, look at it clearly, and then simply walk away from it. Because here is what the research actually shows. Here is what the data says when we stop listening to cultural mythology and start looking at what is real. Study after study conducted over the past 2 decades has found that women who live alone in their later years consistently report higher levels of personal freedom, greater emotional clarity, you stronger friendships, and a deeper sense of identity than women in unfulfilling or low-quality relationships. Let me say that again because it is important. Women living alone report higher life satisfaction than women in poor-quality partnerships. Now, that is not a niche finding from one obscure academic paper. That is a pattern that shows up across the research, from major universities, from longitudinal studies that followed women for decades, from surveys of thousands of women across America and the Western world. The cultural myth says living alone is the lesser option. The data says something completely different, and we are going to spend the next hour and a half unpacking exactly what that difference looks like in real women's real lives. Point 1. Living alone gives you something that nobody talks about enough. It gives you back your nervous system. If you have ever spent years, even decades, in a household organized around someone else's moods, someone else's preferences, someone else's schedule, someone else's emotional state, then you know something about what it does to your body. You know what it is like to hear a key in the lock and feel your whole system shift into a kind of readiness. Not necessarily fear, maybe not even anything you would call stress, just this constant low-level orientation toward another person. What does he need right now? What is his mood? Is everything okay? Am I okay? What do I need to adjust? That kind of orientation, when it goes on long enough, becomes your baseline. It becomes what normal feels like in your body, and you stop even noticing it because it is always there. Like background noise in a house you have lived in so long you cannot hear it anymore. Now imagine that noise stopping. That is what living alone does to your nervous system. Given enough time and enough intentional peace, the constant alertness softens. The readiness fades. Your body stops bracing. Therapists and researchers who work with older women describe this shift in terms that sound almost clinical, but what they are describing is profound. They call it nervous system regulation. What it actually means is this: you finally get to find out what your own default state feels like, your own baseline, your own natural rhythm, without it being constantly calibrated against someone else. So Margaret was 69 when her husband of 44 years passed away after a long illness. She had spent the last 8 years of their marriage as his primary caregiver, and the 8 years before that in a marriage that had quietly become more obligation than love. When I spoke with her, she told me something I have never forgotten. She said, in the first year after he died, I felt guilty every single morning, not because I missed him less than I thought I should, because I felt better. She said she would wake up and her first feeling was not grief. It was this enormous, quiet, inexplicable relief. And then the guilt would come rushing in, because what kind of woman feels relief? What kind of wife feels better? But here is what Margaret understood by year 2. She was not feeling relief that he was gone. She was feeling relief that her nervous system had finally been given permission to rest. That is not a failure of love. That is the body telling the truth. If you have felt something like what Margaret described, I want you to hear this clearly. Your body is not betraying you. Your body is healing, and that healing, that return to your own baseline, that reclaiming of your own nervous system, is one of the most profoundly healthy things that can happen to a woman after 60. Point 2. Living alone lets you discover who you actually are, possibly for the first time in your adult life. This is something that sounds almost too simple when I first say it, but stay with me because I think it goes deeper than it appears. When you have spent 30, 40, even 50 years of your adult life defined in relation to someone else, you are always, on some level, the wife of, the mother of, the partner of. Those are not bad things. They are beautiful things, but they are also identities that are built around relationship to others. And the question that almost never gets asked in that context is the simplest possible question. Who are you when you are not in relation to anyone? Who are you when no one is watching? When no one needs anything from you? When the day is completely unstructured and the choice is completely yours? What do you actually like? Not what you were told you should like. Not what was convenient for the family. Not what you discovered you could tolerate. What do you actually, genuinely, but from the inside of yourself, enjoy? An enormous number of women over 65 do not have a ready answer to that question, not because they are somehow less than or because something went wrong, but simply because they were never given enough uninterrupted time and space to find out. The house was always full of other people's noise. The calendar was always full of other people's needs. And a woman who has spent 40 years being excellent at giving, excellent at adjusting, excellent at making everyone around her comfortable, has often developed those skills at the quiet expense of knowing herself deeply. Living alone changes that, not overnight, not without its uncomfortable stretches, but over time, with the space that solitude provides, something remarkable begins to happen. Women begin to discover preferences they did not know they had. They begin to notice what genuinely delights them when no one else's taste is in the room. They begin to find out that they have opinions about things they thought they had no opinions about. They begin to meet themselves, perhaps for the first time, as fully adult, fully free women, and what they find is almost always surprising. Dorothy, a retired school teacher from Ohio, told me she discovered at 72 that she loved jazz, not as background music, not as something to put on for dinner parties. She meant that she loved sitting in a dark room with a glass of wine and listening to Coltrane at full volume and feeling something move through her chest. She had lived with a man for 38 years who could not stand anything other than country music on the radio. She had never once thought to define herself as someone with musical taste. She said, "I spent 38 years thinking I did not care about music. Turns out I care enormously. I just never had a quiet room to find that out in." What is your jazz? That is the question living alone eventually asks every woman who allows herself to really settle into the life. And the answer, when it comes, is always worth the wait. Point 3. Your friendships will become the most nourishing relationships of your adult life. Here is something the cultural story almost never mentions. When a woman's primary energy is no longer organized around a romantic partnership, something extraordinary tends to happen to her other relationships. Her friendships deepen, not because she has more time, though that matters too, but because she brings more of herself. When you are no longer split between your own needs and the management of a partner's needs, and the maintenance of a household, and the suppression of your own preferences, for the sake of domestic peace, you show up to your friendships differently, more present, more curious, more honest, more genuinely interested, and your friends feel that, and they respond to it. Research from the University of Michigan has found that women over 65 who live alone and maintain active social connections consistently rate their friendships as among the most meaningful relationships they have ever had. More meaningful in many cases than their marriages were at the same stage of life. Now, that is a remarkable finding, and it aligns with something women tell me over and over again when they talk about this chapter of their lives. They say things like, "My friendships now feel like what I always wished my marriage felt like," or "I have never felt this close to another person," or "My best friend knows me better than anyone ever has, including my husband of 30 years. There is a reason for this, the kind of intimacy that gets built between women who have lived long enough to stop pretending, who have earned their honesty through decades of experience, who have nothing left to perform for each other. That kind of intimacy is some of the deepest connection that human beings are capable of. It does not require romance. It does not require cohabitation. It does not require anything except two women who are willing to show up as they actually are. And that kind of showing up is something that living alone quietly teaches you, because when you live alone, there is no one to perform for. And when you stop performing, you become available for real connection. Point 4. You will have a relationship with your own body that you have probably never had before. This one surprises women when I bring it up, but I want you to think about it. For most of us, our relationship with our own bodies has been shaped almost entirely by how other people respond to them, how a husband responded, how the culture responded, how men in general responded. We learned early what our bodies were supposed to look like, supposed to feel like, supposed to do for others. We adjusted, we changed, we criticized ourselves, we approved of ourselves, always in relation to an external gaze, always in relation to how we were being perceived. Living alone removes that external gaze. And it takes time, sometimes quite a bit of time, for the internal gaze to soften as well. But it does soften. And what women describe on the other side of that softening is something that sounds almost like making peace with an old adversary. They stop fighting their bodies. They start listening to them instead. Carol, 71, from Nashville, told me that in the first year after her divorce at 68, she threw away her scale. She said she had weighed herself every single morning for 47 years. Every single morning. And she said, "I do not know why I did it one morning and not the next. But one morning I just picked it up and put it in the trash and went back to the kitchen and made myself breakfast. And I thought, if I get hungry, I will eat. If I feel good, I will move. If I am tired, I will rest. And I have not weighed myself since." She said it was one of the most quietly radical things she had ever done. Not radical for anyone else, just for herself. Just the simple act of no longer evaluating her body every single morning through a number that someone else had decided was meaningful. When you live alone, you begin to eat what you actually want to eat. You begin to sleep when you are tired. You begin to move in ways that feel good, rather than ways that are about producing a particular appearance. You begin, slowly, to inhabit your body as a home rather than a performance. And at 65, 70, 75, there is an enormous gift in that, because you have earned the right to live in your body on your own terms, and living alone gives you the space to actually do it. Point 5. You will discover a relationship with silence that will change how you understand yourself and the world. Our culture is deeply, profoundly uncomfortable with silence. We fill every possible moment with sound, with screens, with voices, with noise. And many of us inherited that discomfort from our households, where silence meant tension, where quiet was something to be broken, where the absence of noise was only comfortable if everyone in the room was content. We learned to fill silence because silence felt like something needed to be fixed. When you live alone, you live with silence. At first, it can feel enormous. It can feel like something pressing in. Some women, in the early weeks and months of living alone, turn the television on as soon as they wake up and leave it on all day, not to watch, just to have sound, just to fill the space. That is completely understandable. The quiet is unfamiliar. Unfamiliar things take adjustment. But when you start to let the silence in, even in small moments, even just for a morning, even just for a Sunday like the one we pictured at the beginning of this video, something begins to happen. You start to hear yourself. Not the voice that tells you what to do, not the voice that manages your schedule and your responsibilities and your obligations. Your deeper voice, the one that knows things, the one that has been patiently waiting underneath all the noise for years, maybe decades, to be listened to. Women who live alone for long enough almost universally describe developing what I think of as an interior life they did not know they had. They start journaling, or meditating, or simply sitting. They discover that they have thoughts they had never followed to their conclusion because there was never enough quiet to follow them. They discover intuitions they had been overriding for years. They discover a kind of inner companionship, a relationship with their own mind and their own deepest self that is rich and sustaining and real. And before I continue, I just want to say a genuine thank you to everyone who has been sending super thanks on these videos. When you do that, you have no idea how much it means to me and how much it helps me keep making content like this for you. If you ever feel moved to do that, the button is right below this video, but truly, just watching and sharing is more than enough. Now, let us keep going. Point 6. By living alone teaches you the difference between loneliness and solitude, and that distinction will set you free. This is one of the most important points in everything we are talking about today, so I want to give it the attention it deserves. Loneliness and solitude are not the same thing. They feel different. They come from different places, and they lead to completely different outcomes. Most people treat them as synonyms because they look the same from the outside. A woman alone at a restaurant, a woman alone on a Sunday afternoon, a woman alone at Thanksgiving. From the outside, these look identical whether the woman is lonely or whether she is in solitude. But from the inside, the experience could not be more different. Loneliness is the pain of unwanted aloneness. It is the feeling of wanting connection and not having access to it. It is a reaching outward that finds nothing to hold. And yes, loneliness is a real experience, and a painful one. Yeah, and we are going to talk about how to address it. But loneliness is not the inevitable result of living alone. It is one possible emotional experience among many, and it is not the permanent or defining experience of most women who live alone by choice or by circumstance. Solitude is entirely different. Solitude is chosen aloneness, or aloneness that has been accepted and befriended. It is the experience of being with yourself, not as a deprivation, but as a presence. Philosophers and writers and contemplatives across thousands of years have described solitude as essential for wisdom, for creativity, for genuine self-knowledge. Aristotle talked about it. Thoreau built a cabin for it. Virginia Woolf wrote an entire book about the necessity of a room of one's own. What they were all pointing toward is the same thing. The self that emerges in solitude is more authentic, more whole, more clear-eyed than the self that is always in relation, always responding, always adjusting to the presence of others. The women who thrive in this chapter of life, and there are millions of them across America right now, are women who have made this shift. They have moved from experiencing their aloneness as loneliness, as the absence of what should be there, to experiencing it as solitude, as the presence of something valuable and nourishing. That shift does not happen automatically. It takes intention, it takes time, it takes, in many cases, the willingness to sit with some discomfort before you get to the peace on the other side. But every woman I have ever spoken with who has made it to the other side of that shift says the same thing. They would not trade it, not for the loneliness of a bad marriage, not for the noise of a household organized around someone else, not for anything. Point 7. You will become a more powerful economic force in your own life than you may ever have been before. This one matters enormously, and it does not get talked about enough. When you live alone, your financial decisions are your own. Completely, entirely. No negotiating, no compromising, no deferring to someone else's opinion about what your money should do. And for many women who spent decades in marriages where financial control, consciously or unconsciously, rested primarily with a husband, this is an experience that is simultaneously terrifying and absolutely exhilarating. Let me be honest with you about the terrifying part first. Many women over 65 who find themselves living alone have never managed their own finances fully. They handled the household budget, they managed the groceries and the utilities. But the broader financial picture, the retirement accounts, the investments, the insurance policies, the estate planning, often that was in someone else's domain, and suddenly being responsible for all of it can feel overwhelming. That feeling is real and it is valid, and we are going to talk about what to do with it in the practical section of this video. But I do not want to stay on the fear, because the flip side of that fear is this. Every woman who has moved through that fear, who has sat down with a financial advisor or taken a class, or simply started asking the questions she was never sure she was supposed to ask, describes emerging from that process feeling something she has rarely felt before: competence. Real, earned, grounded financial competence. She knows what she has. She knows what it costs to maintain her life. She knows what her social security will provide. She knows what Medicare covers and what it does not. She knows what she owns and what she owes. And she knows that whatever happens next, she is capable of navigating it. That kind of competence is not a consolation prize for losing a partner. It is the prize itself. Because you cannot be free if you do not understand your own resources. And when you do understand them, a door opens that was never fully opened before. Judith, 73, from Phoenix, told me that at 70 she took a personal finance class at her local community college. She sat in a room with people who were mostly in their 20s, and she said she felt for the first week deeply embarrassed, like she should have known all of this already, like it was too late to be learning it. And then something shifted. She said she started realizing that she was not behind, and she was right on time, her time. And by the end of that class, she had restructured her retirement withdrawals, set up an emergency fund for the first time in her adult life, and started making decisions about her own money that felt, she said, like picking up a pen and signing her name on a life that actually belonged to her. Point 8. You will develop a relationship with your home that most people never experience. Your home, when you live alone, is not just where you happen to live. It is an expression of you, entirely, unapologetically, completely you, not a compromise, not a negotiation, not a space that has been divided, consciously or unconsciously, into your things and his things, your preferences and his preferences, your corner and the rest. When you live alone, the whole thing is your corner. This sounds small until you have experienced it. Until you have gone through the experience of rearranging furniture, not because someone suggested it, or because it would work better for someone else's habits, but simply because you wanted to see how it felt. Until you have chosen colors for a wall because they made you feel something. Until you have put something on the kitchen counter that serves no practical purpose whatsoever, except that it makes you happy every time you look at it. Until you have had the extraordinary experience of cooking exactly what you wanted to eat, in exactly the quantity you needed, at exactly the time you were hungry, without any reference to anyone else's preferences or schedule or appetite. Women describe this relationship with their homes in language that is almost spiritual. They talk about their apartments, their houses, their condos as sanctuaries, as safe places, as the one space in the world where everything is exactly as they need it to be and nothing requires justification. And in a world that has spent most of these women's lives asking them to justify their preferences, to shrink themselves, to make room, to adjust. Having a space that requires none of that is not a small thing. It is one of the quiet gifts of this chapter, and it compounds over time, growing richer and more deeply personal with every season that passes. Point 9. Your health, when you actively choose to protect it, will surprise you. Here is something that challenges the story our culture tells about aging women living alone. The story says that a woman without a partner to take care of her is more vulnerable, more at risk, more likely to decline. And there is a kernel of something in that story that has to do with real risks around isolation and health monitoring. We are going to address those honestly. But the broader story is far more complicated than the simple equation of partner equals health. In fact, research on women's health in later life has found something striking. Women who are in high stress or low quality relationships, and there are many, many women in those relationships, have significantly higher levels of cortisol, the body's stress hormone, than women who live alone in supportive social networks. High cortisol is associated with inflammation, with heart disease, with compromised immune function, with accelerated aging at the cellular level. In other words, staying in a relationship that has become a source of chronic stress is not a health protective choice. It is a health damaging one. And the women who are living alone in peace, with good friendships, with a relationship to their own bodies that is kind and attentive, those women are not the ones at greatest health risk. Often they are among the healthiest. That said, and I want to be completely honest here, there are real and important things a woman living alone needs to be intentional about for her physical health. Regular medical checkups matter more, not less, when you live alone. Having a system of accountability with a friend or family member about how you are feeling matters. Staying physically active, not for vanity, not for a number on a scale, but for strength and mobility and energy and brain health, matters enormously. Eating well, which is harder when cooking for one, requires some creative problem solving. We will talk about all of this in the practical section, because health in this chapter is not something that happens to you. It is something you participate in actively. And a woman who lives alone and chooses that participation is not at a disadvantage. She is one of the most powerful advocates her own body has ever had. Point 10. You will understand, possibly for the first time, what it means to choose your own life. I want you to think about the choices you have made over the past 40, 50 years. How many of them were truly yours? Not in the sense that no one forced you, because perhaps no one did, but in the deeper sense. How many of the choices that shaped your life, where you lived, how you spent your days, what your home looked like, what you ate when you went to sleep, how you organized your time and your energy and your attention. How many of those were genuinely an expression of who you are versus an expression of who you needed to be in the context of your relationship, your family, your household? For most women over 65, the honest answer is that a significant portion of those choices were shaped by relationship context. Not by force, not by anything as dramatic as that, simply by the gravitational pull of another person's preferences, another person's needs, another person's rhythms. We adjust, we accommodate. We find our lane within the lane that the relationship has established, and we call that compromise. And sometimes it is compromise, beautiful, loving, mutual compromise that makes a life with someone worth the cost. But sometimes, if we are very honest with ourselves, it is less compromise and more disappearing, slowly, quietly, with the best possible intentions. Living alone after 60 is, among other things, an invitation to reappear, to come back to yourself, to start making choices that are genuinely, unmistakably yours. And what I have seen over and over again in the women who embrace this chapter rather than merely endure it, is that this experience of choosing, of actually living in accordance with their own preferences and values and desires, feels like something they did not have a word for before. The closest word is sovereignty, the experience of being the author of your own days. The experience of standing in your own kitchen on an October morning with a coffee cup you actually chose, in a quiet that you have made your peace with, in a life that is finally, fully, unmistakably yours. This is the emotional peak of everything we are talking about today, and I want to give it all the space it deserves. I want to tell you about a woman named Ruth. Ruth was 74 when I spoke with her. She lived in a small house outside of Asheville, North Carolina. She had been married for 41 years to a man she described as not cruel, not unkind, simply absent. Absent in the way some men are present in a room, but somewhere else entirely. She raised 3 children. She taught Sunday school for 20 years. She organized the neighborhood 4th of July gathering every single summer. She was, by every external measure, a woman who had a full life. And she was, by her own honest reckoning, a woman who had spent 4 decades feeling vaguely invisible. Her husband died when she was 71, and she told me that the first thing she felt before the grief, before anything else, was this. She felt seen, not by anyone in particular, not by another person. She felt seen by herself. She said, "It was like I had been walking around in a fog for so long that I thought the fog was just what the world looked like. And then one morning I woke up and the fog was gone. And I could see everything. I could see myself." Yet she spent the next 3 years doing things she had never done. She took a painting class and discovered she was actually quite good. She joined a book club that met at a wine bar and started reading novels she had been putting off for 40 years. She got a little dog, a terrier named Hazel, which her husband had always vetoed. She started waking up at 5 in the morning, not because she had to, but because she discovered she loved the hour before sunrise. They loved the darkness turning slowly to light, loved watching it happen from her porch, with Hazel in her lap and coffee going cold in her hand. She said, "I do not miss being married. I miss being young, but I do not miss being married, and I want you to hear that not as a sad thing, but as the most honest, hard-won, courageous thing a woman of 74 can say, because it means she knows herself. And knowing yourself, truly knowing yourself at any age, is one of the rarest and most precious things a human being can achieve. You are not a woman whose life wound down into aloneness. You are a woman whose life opened up into freedom. And the difference between those 2 sentences is the difference between a consolation prize and the prize itself. Now let us talk about the practical, because all of this is true and important and worth hearing. And also, you wake up every morning in a real American life that has real practical requirements. And I want to give you specific, concrete, actionable things you can do this week and in the coming months to make this chapter as rich and nourishing and genuinely wonderful as it has the potential to be. Practical step 1. Build your board of directors. I want you to think of your life right now as a company, your life incorporated. And every successful company has a board of directors, people with different kinds of expertise who advise the CEO, which is you. Your board of directors does not need to be formal or official. It is simply a set of people you have deliberately identified and cultivated as your go-to resources for different areas of your life. Your board might include one close friend who is your emotional anchor, the one you call when something is hard, the one who knows your history and loves you anyway. Every woman needs exactly one person like this in her life, and if you do not have one, finding one through a book club, a church group, a community class, a neighborhood association is your most important social priority right now. It also includes someone who is financially knowledgeable, a family member, a friend, a professional financial advisor, someone you can ask questions without embarrassment and who will give you honest answers. It includes someone who is medically knowledgeable, or at least medically attentive, a friend who will notice if you seem unwell, a family member you have told to call you regularly. Your board of directors is your safety net, and your sounding board and your witness all at once. Build it deliberately, and then invest in it. Practical step 2. Create a morning ritual that is entirely yours. This sounds simple. It is not simple. It is one of the most powerful things you can do for your mental and emotional health in this chapter. A morning ritual. A sequence of actions you perform every single morning that signals to your brain and your body that this day is yours, is one of the most reliable generators of what researchers call positive affect, which is really just the scientific term for feeling good. Your ritual might be coffee on the porch before you look at your cell phone. It might be 10 minutes of stretching to music you love. It might be writing 3 things you are grateful for in a notebook kept on your nightstand. It might be a walk around the block before breakfast. It does not need to be elaborate. It does not need to take a long time. It simply needs to be yours, chosen by you, for you, every morning, consistently, because consistency is what turns a pleasant activity into something that anchors your sense of self and your sense of agency in your own life. Practical step 3. Solve the cooking for one problem intentionally. This is one of the most practical and underrated challenges of living alone. And most advice about it is either condescending or not particularly useful. So let me be direct. Cooking for one is genuinely harder than cooking for a household. You buy fresh vegetables and they go bad before you can use them. You make a recipe and have leftovers for a week. You get tired of cooking entirely and end up eating crackers and cheese and calling it dinner, which is fine sometimes and not fine all the time. Here is what actually works. First, say find 2 or 3 other women in your area who live alone and establish a Sunday cooking rotation. Everyone makes one large dish each week. You divide it up and everyone goes home with variety. This is about the social connection as much as the food. Second, invest in a small, slow cooker if you do not already have one. A slow cooker lets you make soups, stews, and casseroles in quantities that freeze well and reheat beautifully. Third, give yourself permission to eat unconventionally. Breakfast for dinner. A beautiful salad as the entire meal. Cheese and good bread and fruit arranged on a plate like something from a French bistro. Nobody is grading your dinner. Eat what nourishes you and brings you pleasure. Practical step 4. Get financially clear even if it is uncomfortable. If you do not know exactly what you have and what you owe and what comes in and what goes out every month, this is your week to find out. Not because you are in danger, not because anything is wrong, but because clarity about your own resources is one of the most empowering things a woman can have. You cannot make good decisions about your life from a position of financial vagueness. You can only make fearful ones. Sit down with your bank statements from the last 3 months. Write down your income, Social Security, pension, any retirement account withdrawals, any other sources. Write down your fixed expenses. Write down your variable expenses. See the full picture. If that picture reveals something you need to address it with a professional. Many community organizations offer free financial counseling for women over 60. Your local library often has resources. AARP offers financial guidance. You have options. And knowing where you stand is always, always better than not knowing. Practical step 5. Invest in one new experience every single month. This is the one that sounds like a luxury, but is actually medicine. Research on brain health and cognitive aging is very clear on this point. Novelty, new experiences, learning new skills, engaging with unfamiliar environments and ideas and people is one of the most powerful things you can do to keep your brain healthy as you age. It is not extra credit, it is essential maintenance. Your new monthly experience does not need to be expensive or exotic. It could be a class at the local community center, a museum you have never been to, a restaurant that serves food from a country you have never visited, a movie in a genre you would not normally choose, a library lecture on a topic you know nothing about. a volunteer opportunity with an organization working on something you care about. The specific activity matters much less than the fact of doing something new, something that makes your brain work in a slightly different way, something that puts you in a room with people you have not already met. The women who are thriving in this chapter of life are not the ones waiting for life to come to them. They are the ones who wake up on the first of every month and ask themselves, "What have I never done that I could do this month?" And then they do it. And then they do it again. And now I want to bring us back to where we started, because we began this morning in a kitchen. October light through the window, coffee in a mug you actually chose, quiet that belongs entirely to you. And I want to stay there for a moment, because I think that image holds something true that I do not want us to leave too quickly. There is a woman in that kitchen. She is not incomplete. She is not waiting. She is not the lesser version of a life that went a different way. She is the fullest version of herself she has perhaps ever been. She has lived long enough to know what she actually values. She has survived enough to know what she is made of. She has earned the right to a morning that answers to no one but her. She is sitting in the October light, and she is drinking her coffee, and she is thinking quietly, without saying it to anyone, because there is no one to say it to, and that is completely and entirely fine. This is mine, not a consolation, not a settling, not a what is left after the real thing did not work out. This is the thing itself. This is a woman in full possession of her own life. And that is not a lesser prize. That is the whole game. That is what all of it was leading toward. The space to be completely, unapologetically, radiantly, freely yourself. You deserve this chapter, not in spite of everything you have been through, because of it. Because you have done the work and lived the years and made the choices and survived the losses and found your way to this morning, this kitchen, this coffee, this quiet, and it is yours. All of it is yours, and you are, in every way that matters, exactly where you were always supposed to be. If this video spoke to something in you today, if it named something you have felt but never quite heard out loud, I want to ask you to do one thing. Share this with a woman in your life who needs to hear it today. Forward it to your best friend. Send it to your daughter. Pass it along to the woman in your church group who has just moved into her own place and is not sure yet what to make of it. Because every woman who hears this deserves to know what you now know. Living alone after 60 is not the consolation prize. It never was. It is the prize, and she has already won it.